Hi, my name's Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we're painting the God of Thunder, the Son of Odin, and the hottest Avenger, Thor. What up, mini family? In celebration of Avengers Endgame just coming out, I decided to paint one of the characters from the movie. So I put a poll out on my YouTube community and you guys picked Thor. By the way, if you want to get notifications for these polls, make sure to hit the bell icon next to the subscribe button. But before we get started painting and doing all kinds of stuff to Thor's body, we need a plan. So, to the chalkboard. You thought I was going to stop drawing after the Shazam video? Haha, think again. Welcome to Conversion City. The model that I have for Thor is the old comic book Thor, and I want to make him look more like the Infinity War Thor. Starting out with number 1, a head swap. Since there is no Infinity War Thor head, this is going to involve finding a generic head and probably sculpting some hair and some beard. Ooh, fun. Second conversion, we need to do a weapon swap. The Thor that I have has Mjolnir, or however you pronounce it. I'm sure you will correct me in the comment section below. No, he has Stormbreaker, which is a weird axe Warhammer hybrid thing. So we're going to need to swap that weapon out. Number 3, a lot of people asked me to do non-metallic metal in the YouTube community post. So we're going to do some NMM scale mail. Ooh, spooky. Is that one word or 2 words? And finally, number 4, for the scheme, we'll do a mixture of the comic book and also the movie. In the movie, Thor's got all kinds of black stuff. He's got black metal. He's got black leathers. It's just a lot of dark and dreary stuff, which isn't the most fun to paint, but it does look pretty cool in the movie. So to get some of that color and that pop in there, we'll take some inspiration from the comic book when painting up our Thor. All right, we got a plan. Let's hit it. All right, that is a lot of conversion, but before we get started on the conversion, I think we should just start by cleaning up the model. So let's hit it. The reason why I want to clean the miniature before converting it is I feel like while I'm converting it, hacking it up, I'll just start popping off limbs that are super glued in. So I'll clean it first, do the conversion, and then assemble it. The cleaning wasn't too difficult to get through. Now with that done, we're going to move on to the weapon conversion, replacing his hammer with Stormbreaker. The first thing we obviously need to do is clip off Mjolnir. I'm going to mispronounce that every single time. And then next we need to sand off his strap because his axe, Stormbreaker, doesn't have a strap attached to it. I used a flat file and kind of just went really slow. I might have shaved off a little bit too much of his hand. His fist looks a little bit small compared to the size of his bicep, so we'll need to adjust that once the axe is in place. We need to make sure that we make a nice flat area on one side of his hands so that we can poke a little tiny pilot hole with an awl. Once that hole is poked, we can take a Dremel or any rotary tool, and with a sufficiently small bit, we can drill a hole straight through the fist. Now with the hole drilled, we can start working on the handle of Stormbreaker, and the first thing we need to do is look at some references from the movie. And taking a look at this screenshot, we can see that the handle is actually quite long. It goes from about his shoulder all the way down to the top of his knee. So it's a pretty big thing. Additionally, it's also really thick. Thor can't grasp the entire handle and touch his middle finger to his thumb. Now we can't necessarily replicate that feature. That would involve resculpting his hand, but it's still a good thing to kind of keep in mind when we're shaping and sizing the handle. With the dimensions kind of understood, we'll start with the paper clip armature. We'll cut it off, make sure it can fit in the whole hand, and we'll start to bend it around because this is a stick after all and not necessarily a forged handle by a blacksmith. So it isn't perfectly straight, it's kind of bendy and wavy. Now with the axe handle kind of figured out, we'll move on to the axe head, which is more of a axe plus Warhammer combo. The butt end of the axe is really thick and meaty and almost looks a little bit longer than the axe itself. Now while I've never done this before, I kind of understand the general gist of how to make a weapon head in miniature form. So first we'll start by taking some milliput and mixing it up and flattening it out. Now I'm flattening it out on a piece of acetate here because I don't want any of the debris from my desk cutting mat to get in the milliput itself. I want it to be pure milliput. And probably some dog hair. I thought that I could use water to kind of lubricate the surface so that the milliput wouldn't stick to the acetate, but I couldn't have been more wrong and actually kind of fused it to the surface more than I thought it might. So I did it again on the other side of the acetate with just oil this time. Now you want to make sure that you have a good amount of thickness when rolling out this milliput so that you can shave it away if you don't need it. If you don't have it in the first place, it's a little bit harder to kind of thicken up your weapon. And I'm primarily concerned with the Warhammer end of our weapon. Now, when the milliput has had about 24 hours to cure, we're going to start to sketch out the profile of Stormbreaker. And when we kind of get something that's believable and maybe to scale, we'll take a Dremel and a cutting wheel and start to cut out the shape of what we had drawn. Definitely want to use a mask while doing this. This gets dust everywhere. Some people say to bake the milliput to make it even more brittle, but I was concerned with having a break point in between the axe head and the hammer being weak. So what I did was I just kept it in kind of its cured state so that it was a little bit elastic still so it wouldn't break right in the middle. Once I got the basic shape of the axe cut out, I went to work with files to refine the shape and also to begin beveling the axe head itself. Now, the one big thing about this is you want to go really slow, and you also want to hold the axe head in such a way that you are supporting its weak spots. This thing can snap super easily, so just be aware of that. After I had the bevel on the axe head kind of worked out, I moved toward the Warhammer end, and this is kind of angular, so I just made sure to have nice flat areas on the Warhammer. I cut some with the X-Acto knife. I filed some down to make it like a octagon on the end. So now we'll start to drill the hole for the handle. And this is very precarious because I don't want to drill it right in the middle where the Warhammer and the axe meet, because I'm definitely going to snap it in half. There isn't enough material there. So I'll offset the hole a little bit toward the axe, which is thicker and more meaty. And then I'll sculpt the tree branch detail more toward the center of the axe to make it look like the handle is centered while not risking my little weapon head. Once the hole is drilled, I'll glue in the handle and then glue the axe to Thor, and then I can begin my sculpting work. With the axe handle glued in, it's time to start sculpting on some wood texture. I made sure to scuff up the wire armature with the triangle file to give the epoxy sculpt something to grip onto. I also applied a very small amount of super glue for the epoxy sculpt to cling to. You need to add a very small amount because you don't want the super glue to get on the outside of the epoxy sculpt, because then it makes it very hard to shape and smooth out to your desire. Once I had it on there, it was just a matter of kind of shaping it into a wood-like form, which is pretty simple. I took a color shaper with a sculpted edge and started to kind of just run it in the epoxy sculpt, and it made a branch-like texture. It's pretty simple. I also rolled out some little snakes out of epoxy sculpt and kind of curved it around the top to simulate the branch wrapping around the head of the weapon. I made sure the axe handle was pretty thick to stay true to the movie reference, but I had to taper it around the hand to make sure that the closed fist grip looked more realistic and not out of place. Okay, now it's time to move on to the face conversion. This is actually a little bit scary because the head is kind of like sunken into a little pewter basin. Before we start doing destructive things though, I want to make sure that I have a head that looks good, that'll be worthy to put in there. So I went to my local game store and I bought Superman, who has a pretty kind of generic face, and I think we can make him look like the movie Thor. But we need to do that first before I start slashing and cutting up Thor's face. So let's start by filing down that characteristic Superman hair curl thing, and also maybe kind of trimming down the rest of his hair to make space for the hair that we'll add after this. After I shaved off all the hair, I grabbed some green stuff and just started to pile it on his head. In the movie, Chris Hemsworth kind of styles his hair pushed forwards, so I put a lot of the hair at the front of his forehead and ran my sculpting tool front to back to give the impression that the hair was slicked forward. In order to get very small pieces of green stuff attached to his sideburn area and also his chin area, I made sure to scuff it up with an X-Acto knife to make it more tactile for that stuff to stick to it. I'm using green stuff because it's green, frankly. Epoxy sculpt is gray, and it's hard to see what difference you are making on the miniature when the putty is the exact same color as the material the model was casted in. For what it's worth, epoxy sculpt seems to be a little bit softer than green stuff. I'm not sure if it's because my green stuff is older than my epoxy sculpt, but that's currently my experience. Kinda looks like Chris Hemsworth, but not really. I'm not too worried about it, however, because a lot of miniature representation of famous people is oftentimes pretty bad. Okay, now comes the time that I am dreading. The converted Thor head is done and it looks good enough. So I need to cut off the old head, and I'm a little bit concerned about a few things. Number one, I'm concerned that it's gonna be too small. I perused some other miniatures, but I couldn't find one that was sufficiently generic enough and also big enough. The old head was bulked up by a beautiful mane, a winged helmet, and also was in general just kind of wider. And this model is also out of print. You can't buy it anymore. So if I mess it up, that's it. I can't get a new one. And this is pretty easy to mess up because it's not a straightforward head removal. I need to kind of dig down into his body. But you know, I could sit here and make excuses all day long. And in the words of my friend Ryan, who I met at Adepticon, hang dong or kick rocks. And I think it's time to hang some dong. But first, let's remorse. Alright, enough of that shit. Let's grind a dude's head off. Okay, the head removal went great. There's a nice socket for our new head. So I'm gonna cut off the new head, trying to preserve the neck, and then shave it down to fit into the socket as necessary. And after all is said and done, the new head looks a little small. That's unfortunate, but it isn't the end of the world. This will just be a lesson that I learned and also something that I can refer to in the future. If you're concerned about a head looking too small on a conversion, this is what it could look like. Is that within your tolerance level or not? That's for you to decide. But for now, I'm gonna keep soldiering on and keep hanging dongs. To bulk up the head a bit more and to match the movie, I gave Thor a collar. This also nicely hid the gap in between the body and the neck. Now on to the final bit of conversion, a fun display base. I wanted to give the impression that Thor had just landed on the ground and he was splitting it in half. So I busted out a ton of epoxy sculpt and started to smear it all over the base of my little circular display plinth. After I had a somewhat level surface of epoxy sculpt, I started to draw some lines that resembled cracked earth. When I had the cracked earth mapped out, I grabbed another color shaper and started to smooth out the crack to kind of give it more of a groove look as opposed to I just ran a knife through epoxy sculpt look. To give the base some more texture and more variety, I superglued on some smaller rocks, and then I also superglued on some dirt, but I made sure to not put any of the dirt inside the cracks. I wanted those to be smooth earth, like it was rock that split. Once all the dirt was down, I sealed it all in with some super glue thin, which is like my new favorite way of sealing in terrain in small quantities like this. All right, to start out with the paint job, we're going to undercoat Thor in black and then zenithally highlight him with some white ink. Now I want to kind of bust through the red cloak, so we're going to paint it in the same way that we painted Shazam's red outfit, with some red ink and some fluorescent red ink for the highlights. If you want some more information about that specific process, make sure to check out that video linked in the top right hand corner right now. I honestly didn't know where to start with this miniature, and there are so many different versions of Thor's costume, so I kind of just picked one and rolled with it. I started by blocking in the black areas, his chest and leg armor. Armor? Boot? High boot? Knee-high boot. Pretty sexy, Thor. Next, I started to work on the non-metallic metal scale mail, and this may seem more difficult than just normal armor, but I'm gonna say that it's probably a little bit simpler than you think it is. The first step I did was starting to lay out where to put the highlights and shadows, and you can think of all of his arms and his legs as just big cylinders, so they have long running highlights. I'm also not going to put the strongest highlight immediately on top of his arm. I'm going to kind of shift it down the arm a few degrees, trying to think about where the light would reflect off of his armor and into the viewer's eyes if the sun was directly above him and the viewer was directly in front of him. If you want a much more thorough description about where to place your highlights and shadows for non-metallic metal projects, make sure to watch my non-metallic metal video linked in the top right-hand corner of the screen. The reason why I think doing non-metallic metal scale mail is easier than normal non-metallic metal is because blending is kind of removed from the equation. There's such little individual area on each scale to blend that you don't need to. You can just do a pretty sharp transition in color, and since it's so small, you won't be able to tell. So I applied some rough highlights with white and black and kind of roughed that in, and then broke out the black paint and did some recess shading, followed up by some edge highlighting. And then I kind of followed that exact same procedure for his other arm and his 2 legs. I decided to repaint Thor's cape because I wasn't liking the pink at all. So I started with a very dark, desaturated color and highlighted it with progressively more and more saturated reds. Typically when I highlight things, I'll mix in a color like off-white, like maybe a yellowy white or a bluish white. But in the case of red, if I do that, then it might turn out too pink. So instead of increasing in brightness, I increase in saturation when highlighting red. That isn't to say that you can't mix a little white into your red to get like your extreme highlights, but you can't use so much that it turns out to be pink. After the red cloak, I began to work on the black armor, and a lot of the same concepts we explored in the Jon Snow video are in use here, but I'll recap the most important one. You need to ensure that enough black sticks around in the shadow and the midtone for it to read as black in the end. If you have too much dark gray in the midtone, it ends up looking like dark gray. Additionally, a satin black like Abaddon black can help a lot with getting the right level of darkness. For more information, check out the Jon Snow video linked in the top right hand corner of the screen. Next, after I got the black armor to a good spot, I started to work on the belt materials, and for this I used a dark chocolatey brown. And since it's such a small little detail, you kind of have to push the contrast really far to see what's going on. So I bumped it up to a pretty bright highlight and also recess shaded with pure black. It's also important to remember with these tiny little straps to run a very thin recess shade of black along them so you can separate them from the black chest armor below. Before we continue to paint Thor, one quick announcement. If you want to win this model, I'm giving it away to one of my patrons. So you can find out more about how to win it in the description below at patreon.com/Miniac. All right, back to the video. Next, I worked on the non-metallic metal Stormbreaker weapon head. For axe heads, kind of what you do is just map out some random areas of highlight and shadow. Typically, I like to favor larger areas of highlight. And these highlights and shadows are running perpendicular to the edge of the axe. And I'm kind of wet blending and feathering. I'm smudging the colors essentially to get some initial blends. And then once my colors are kind of in regions that I like, I start to strengthen the contrast via glazing in a darker black color or glazing in a brighter white color around the areas where the highlights already are. Now, since we're doing non-metallic metal for the axe head, we also have to do non-metallic metal for the buttons that are presumably keeping his cloak on its body. And I wanted to do these more kind of like a brass color, less of a rich gold color. So I started with a base coat of a rich brown color, the same color that I used for the belts. And then I mixed in ivory, a little bit of yellow, and a little bit of orange to get my initial highlight colors. And I continued to mix in more orange, more yellow, and more ivory until I was just using pure ivory. Now these are kind of like discs with a sphere in the middle. So you want to highlight the disc like it's a compact disc with rays that intersect in the middle of the disc. And then with the sphere in the middle of the disc, you want to highlight it like a sphere with spherical highlights. Oftentimes a little trick that can make stuff look reflective is to have the highlight on top of the sphere and then to come in with an edge highlight toward the bottom of it where the shadow is. Next, we'll begin working on the skin tone. We'll start with a darker color and then build up the highlights by mixing in an ivory tone. Just like with the other 80 times I've painted a miniature face, I'm targeting the forehead, the top of the nose, tops of the cheekbones, and I'm favoring one side of the face, the side away from his weapon, with my highlights. Now, since Thor has a beard, painting the hair is kind of integral to finishing the face, so I started working on that. With a light brown color, I base coated the hair and the beard, followed by highlights where I mixed in ivory and a yellow color to get the blonde look. It's important for a realistic blonde to not go full-on yellow, but rather a muddier color. With the beard color in place, we can make sure the two are separated by a nice dark line. I had an idea for eyes. In the final act of Infinity War, Thor goes all nutty and has blue eyes, so I figured I'd make his eyes glowing blue and also his weapon and the cracks in the ground. I started with dark blue in the eyes, followed by a very bright teal. Since they're so small, you don't need so many layers to make it look bright. On the axe, I started with some lightning strike shapes in the same dark blue and filled in the beams with a brighter blue, and in some areas went as bright as white. Next, let's paint the base. Just like with the two previous elements, I painted the cracks in the ground with the blues, making the areas where the cracks meet brighter. Then I painted on a very rich brown color onto the dirt. After that, I dry brushed on very lightly an ivory color. I then added some dry pigments to get a nice dusty look. I put some on his boots as well to drive home the "I just landed" and cause a huge commotion feel. For some more diversity, I put some various clumps of foliage, and then I cleaned up the sides of the base room, and then I was finally done. Honestly, I didn't have a lot of fun painting this, and I'm not entirely sure why. I stalled a lot during the process, especially during the conversion, because I was scared of messing up. And nothing about the paint job was really getting my loins moist until the very end with the blue lightning accents. Let's head to the chalkboard to do our final review. Welcome back to the chalkboard of all power and all knowledge. Probably the first thing that I learned was, if you're going to sculpt something, you need to make sure the detail on it is reasonably paintable. On several areas on the hair and also on the handle of Stormbreaker, I made these really tiny micro scratches that I could never paint. Those scratches should have been smoothed out with a color shaper to make it more reasonable. And also not to look so random. Everything should look intentional, like it's supposed to be there. Number 2, scale mail, still isn't sure if that's one word or two word, is not that hard to paint. It's not the easiest non-metallic metal object to paint, but it certainly is a kind of a good intermediate area if you're looking to kind of train something new. Don't be scared of it. And number 3, I want to bring up something about the head swap, but also just conversion in general. 1, you shouldn't be afraid to try things if it's not going to turn out. It might not sometimes, but it's going to look pretty good in the end, no matter what. Now, when I did the head swap, I made sure that the scale was the same. The length of their heads was both equal. But one thing I didn't take into account was just maybe how out of whack the proportions were of the miniature that I was using. I mean, if you look at his biceps and his forearms, they're like over half the width of his frickin' chest, which is probably not right. So scale isn't the only important thing when you're looking to do swaps like this. Another important thing is also just, what are the proportions of your model? Is he big and bulky, or is he thin and frail? Something to definitely look into. All right, that's it. Time to end this video. Well guys, thanks for checking out this video. Let me know what you thought of my interpretation of Infinity War Thor in the comment section below. If you want to see more videos kind of in this style, you can find them linked in a playlist in the top right hand corner of the screen right now. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are several links in the description that enable you to do so, namely a Patreon campaign with a bunch of fun rewards, such as a Discord server where you and I can hang out any day of the week, and also an Amazon shopping affiliate link that you can use while shopping on Amazon. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint my minis!